This is how Secretary of State Hillary Clinton found out that Muammar Gadhafi might be captured or dead, or captured then dead. At the time, earlier today, it was unclear which.
Wow. Huh.
Unconfirmed.
Unconfirmed. Yeah. Unconfirmed. No. Unconfirmed reports about Gadhafi being captured.
Really?
Unconfirmed. Yeah. We've had too many. We've had a bunch of those before. We've had, you know, have had him captured a couple of times.
That very, very, very pregnant woman who you saw handing Secretary Clinton her BlackBerry there in that footage, that's Huma Abedin, famous for being one of the Secretary's senior aides for a very long time now, and also famous, incidentally, for being married to Congressman Anthony Weiner. I know, like a weird detail, but it was a small snapshot, a strange set of detail that we got there about how the news of Muammar Gadhafi's capture or death spread around the world, even at the highest levels of government. And once the news was confirmed that Gadhafi was not just captured, but in fact dead, it immediately became clear that there would never be an Israeltine. Remember Israeltine? Israeltine was Gadhafi's personal solution to the decades-long Israel-Palestine issue. Rather than negotiating a two-state solution, an Israel and a Palestine, Gadhafi's big innovation was that he would combine them. He would combine Israel and Palestine into a new thing that Gadhafi said should be called Israeltine. Gadhafi also once decided he did not like the names of the months, so he took a look at the calendar and renamed a couple of the months. August became Hannibal, named after his son, Hannibal, I guess. July renamed Nasser in honor of Egypt's second president. Gadhafi delivered the Israeltine speech at the United Nations in New York back in 2009. That was the very first and the only time Gadhafi ever visited the United States. In that speech, he spoke at great length, 90 minutes. He did the whole Israeltine thing. He pretended to rip up the UN Charter. Gadhafi also made a lot of New York area local news on that 2009 trip because he had said he wanted to stay in a tent instead of in a hotel room. He wanted to pitch that tent in Central Park in New York City. He was, frankly, interested in doing that, but New York was not interested in having him. Thank you very much. So the colonel ended up pitching his sleeping tent on some property north of the city, some property, incidentally, that was owned by Donald Trump. The process that resulted in Gadhafi finally being allowed to come to New York and pitch both the idea of Israeltine and a tent up at Trump's place, that process started actually right after 9/11. Gadhafi was one of the first Arab leaders to denounce the 9/11 attacks. He shared intelligence with the U.S. about al-Qaeda, and then he made an agreement with the Bush administration to give up his weapons of mass destruction program. In return, what the U.S. traded for all of that was bringing Gadhafi essentially in from the cold. We pretended like Gadhafi wasn't a murderous rogue dictator and narcissistic freak show in exchange for a sort of alliance, a pretend relationship, a facade of an effort to treat Libya like a country, like a normal country with a normal president. But Libya under Muammar Gadhafi was not a normal country, and he was not a normal president. Libya under Gadhafi had blown up a Pan Am 747 over the town of Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. All 259 people on board were killed. 11 people on the ground were killed by falling debris. Libya under Gadhafi also blew up a French passenger jet over Niger in 1989. Another 170 people killed there. It was behind the hijacking of the Achille Lauro, an Italian cruise ship. And in 1984, officials in the Libyan embassy in London, or at least somebody inside the Libyan embassy in London, fired at protesters, shot at protesters, and killed a police officer. Gadhafi is also reported to have had his forces storm a prison near Tripoli and massacre more than 1,000 prisoners there. But then the American relationship with Gadhafi went from us bombing Libya in 1986 because he was that kind of country and that kind of tyrant. It went from us bombing them in 1986 to this kind of thing. An official visit by a delegation of American senators led by Arizona Republican John McCain, who even tweeted about this trip, tweeted about staying up all night with the colonel and what an interesting man Gadhafi was. Today, in response to the news of Gadhafi's death in Libya, Senator McCain said, quote, "I think it's a great day."
I think it's a great day. I think the administration deserves great credit. Obviously, I had different ideas on the tactical side, but the world is a better place, and the Libyan people now have a chance. But this is just the beginning.
The ambassador to the United States from the post-Gadhafi government in Libya was asked for his response to Gadhafi's death. He said this.
Thank you very much, America. Thank you. You took the right decision.
Thank you very much, America. You took the right decision. In February, against the backdrop of the popular uprisings all over the Arab world, the Arab Spring, right, the ouster of the long-standing dictator in Tunisia, the fall in just a matter of days of the seemingly permanent dictator Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the people of the one country that borders both of those other places, the people of Libya, took to the streets against their own seemingly permanent, seemingly omnipotent dictator. In response, Gadhafi called his own people rats and cockroaches and drug addicts and terrorists. He promised he would crush them. Whether or not the rebels ever had the option, it was pretty clear from the outset in Libya that there was never going to be a peaceful demonstration, sit-in type protest movement to try to get rid of Gadhafi. It was pretty clear from the very beginning that it was going to be an armed conflict. It was always going to be a military conflict. And although there were high-level defections of Libyan officials early on, Gadhafi turned the might of the military, including the militias run by his sons, against his people, against the rebels who were rising up against him. Early on, the rebels did not have the skills or the training to fight very well, no matter how hard they wanted to fight, no matter how much they were willing to sacrifice.
Another rebel showed me he isn't actually armed at all.
It's a toy gun. This is amazing. He just handed me his gun. I didn't realize until he put it in my hands. It's actually just made of plastic. It's a toy.
The rebels have no communications, no commanders, but they do have weapons. Artillery, mortars, even surface-to-surface rockets, but no idea how to use them.
Faced with the increasingly likely and promised prospect that Gadhafi's military would destroy the rebel-held city of Benghazi in Libya, the United States agreed to take part in, but not lead, a military mission to essentially take the rebels' side. The United Nations authorized a military mission to protect Libya's civilians, which meant, of course, protecting civilians from Gadhafi. Although President Obama pledged repeatedly that the U.S. would not lead that military effort, that the United States would just be one player in an ensemble effort, in fact, the U.S. was in the lead, especially in the first weeks of the operation. We spend more on our military than all other countries in the world combined. And we have been at war constantly for the last 10 years. And we have military and technological capacity that other countries do not have. So when it came to drones and command and control and some intelligence and targeting and surveillance, the United States was in the lead. But over time, compared with other NATO countries, the proportion of American, say, air sorties, the proportion of U.S. responsibility in that NATO military effort declined, and no U.S. combat troops were ever deployed in Libya. By August, Gadhafi had fled his home in Tripoli, in Libya's capital city, and the rebels gleefully overran his compound in Tripoli. Since then, since taking Tripoli, the rebels consolidated their gains. They took control of basically every city and every region in Libya, except for Gadhafi's hometown of Sirte. Well, today, Sirte fell to the rebels, and reportedly, while fleeing Sirte, Muammar Gadhafi was killed. Now, I want to show some of what we know happened today. Fair warning here, some of these images are a little bit graphic. We will not show them for very long. These images show Gadhafi apparently wounded, maybe still alive, but captured in the back of some vehicle. You can see Gadhafi raising his arm here, see, as he's being pushed around, the people around him taking pictures with him. You can hear gunfire, presumably celebratory gunfire, although we don't know, in the background. Other footage, obviously chaotic, shows what appears to be Gadhafi's dead body on the ground. After a lot of conflicting reports about how exactly he died, there now is no ambiguity about the final result. Muammar Gadhafi is now dead.
When Gadhafi and his forces started going city to city, town by town, to brutalize men, women, and children, the world refused to stand idly by. Faced with the potential of mass atrocities and a call for help from the Libyan people, the United States and our friends and allies stopped Gadhafi's forces in their tracks. Without putting a single U.S. service member on the ground, we achieved our objectives, and our NATO mission will soon come to an end. Working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
What collective action can achieve. Collective action for problems for which the world takes collective responsibility. responsibility to protect civilians. If there is an instance in which the world agrees, the civilized world agrees, the organized civilized world agrees that something needs to be done that requires force, the United States will take part as part of collective action. The president today not only reflecting on the death of Gadhafi, but using the Libya example to explain American foreign policy now, to explain American use of force in a world in which we are the biggest and most capable military in the world, but in a world where we have questions about how frequently and where we should use that military might. We will act when there's a problem in the world that requires force to address it. The U.S. will be involved. We will help organize. We will even lead when necessary, but we will act collectively. We will act with others. Vice President Biden put it even more bluntly and more simply when he said this today about Libya.
That's an example of how the world's beginning to work together.
Joining us now is NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, who was in Libya when the rebellion began and was there to see Tripoli fall in August. Richard, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you very much. And then I was here in New York when I got the call early this morning that there were these reports that Gadhafi was captured. And I think I've been in this building ever since.
We sort of knew that this day might be coming. It seemed like the fall of Gadhafi became inevitable at some point during this uprising. A year ago today, could you have foreseen a popular uprising in Libya toppling him?
No, absolutely not. Gadhafi was strong after the Iraq War when he decided to give up his weapons program. He was emerging as a international figure again. He'd come in from the cold. He was making better relations with the United States, better relations with Europe. Gadhafi's position a year ago looked pretty strong.
Let me ask you if you think this is over now. Do you expect that there could be more violence, that there could be leftover elements of the Gadhafi regime or from anybody else who might mount a sort of insurgency against the new government in Libya?
Well, the war is over, and the war against Gadhafi and his regime ended today. There could be some elements who decide to set off a car bomb in Tripoli or Benghazi. That's possible. You don't need very many people to carry out a couple of terrorist attacks or to open fire someplace. But a war that involves rebel columns moving to advance, to drive back cities and take over cities, no, I think that phase is over.
What do you know? What do you expect about what this new government will be like toward its own population, but also internationally toward potentially extremist groups and toward the United States?
Well, it will be a religious government. The people of Libya are quite religious, and it's no doubt that every time you hear the rebels say something, they say Allahu Akbar. So there will be a definitely more Islamic character going forward in the Libyan state, and that's going to be the same case in Tunisia. There are elections coming up in Tunisia, and it looks like Islamic parties are going to win. Probably the same situation in Egypt. But it will also be in Libya, I expect, a very pro-American government. Right now, this rebel movement is the most pro-American movement in the entire Middle East. When I was there, journalists, American journalists, Americans, or anyone from a NATO